Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to episode 145 of the podcast. And today I am prepping up my 1930s reproduction fabrics so I can create more Dresden plates and rings. I announced this last month. I have come out with the Dresden Plate Template Set again. It has been redesigned so that we can create really creative, unique blocks like this. And we can do minis, we can do rings within rings, we can do all kinds of fun things. And I kind of ended up with the quilt along without really making it a quilt along. I'm going to call it a block along. I'm just going to share 1 or 2 videos on how to make Dresden plates and rings using the new template set. And those videos will come out, 1 to 2 every month. It's not a quilt along because we're not quilting it as we go the way we've done in the past. And also, there is not a quilt pattern. I am literally saying, get 10 to 12 fat quarters, prep them up, get maybe 2 to 3 yards of background fabric, prep it up, and make blocks along with me. It's very laid back. It is not going to be a big production. I simply don't have time for it. And also, my old school way of making quilt-alongs was getting pretty complicated. I think the first block 1 for our friendship pattern, which came out in 2019, I think that was something like 60 odd pages long. And Josh was like, the word simple comes to mind, simplify. And yeah, I was really not doing simplify with that project. So this feels much, much better to me because I'm not writing a pattern for it. It is literally grab a template set, prep up some fabric, and follow along. And I love that. And I love that, no one's really given me a hard time about it so far. Sometimes I think that we can build things up in our heads and maybe make things more complicated than they need to be. So yeah, if you'd like to follow along, all you gotta do is just grab a new Dresden template set. I've redesigned the templates so that they have new etched lines where you can cut thinner strips, you can cut smaller pieces. It is very different from the original template set that I came out with in 2017. So for that reason, if you bought one in 2017 back in the day, you will need another set in order to follow along with these. And I'm going to make 15 blocks total. So sometimes I'm going to do, 1 month I might do 1 block and 1 month I might do 2. We'll just have to play that by ear and see how it's going to work. 1 month at a time. I think that'll work out great. So the topic for this podcast this week, or month, I should say, the topic for the podcast is having the strength to change something that you have done for a very long time. So then this is teaching wise. I have discovered that, a struggle as a professional teacher is, when I'm putting information out there, when I'm saying this is the way to do something, it's understanding, it's hoping that everyone understands that when I'm teaching that, I am saying, this is the way I do this right now. And that sometimes in the course of learning, in the course of changing machines, in the course of becoming a better educator and learning myself, this is a continual growing and learning process. I should not stop learning at any point. In that process, sometimes I realize, oh, wow, that's going to be something that needs to change. I need to change that particular method. So what is it? Drum roll. I did mention this in the last podcast. What is going to change? Some method that I'm using is different now. And that is how I'm pressing seams. Now, caveat. This is only changing on quilts that I am quilting on my long arm and stitching in the ditch. If I decide to quilt a quilt on my long arm and I'm not going to stitch it in the ditch, I'm just going to do all over quilting or whatever, I'm going to continue to piece my quilts with seams wide open because that's the way I really like to piece. It's what I'm used to doing and it's my favorite method, right? But I have noticed on my long arm only when I stitch in the ditch and my seams are pressed open that the size of my needle on the long arm does cause the seam to split. It does break the threads, creating the seam, and I have noticed the fabric's starting to do that gapey thing. So when I saw that, you know, there's that moment of, oh, learning curve. I have just learned something. I have just seen something. That is something that I now need to accept as reality, and I need to change my method. And so I have found my new method for pressing seams when I am going to quilt the quilt on my long arm and I'm going to stitch in the ditch. My new method is to press the seam flat first. I first press it open. I do my little finger crease. I usually get my thumbnail in there and I crease the seam nice and flat so it's open. That gives you the full expression of the seam. Okay? What I mean by that, when you piece a 4-patch, let's say, and they are 2.5-inch cut squares, right? That should piece and finish, or it should be pieced to measure 4.5 inches square. I found early on when I first began piecing that whenever I press the seams to one side, just straight over to one side, a lot of fabric got caught up in that fold and reduced the size of my block. So instead of measuring 4.5 inches exactly, it would end up measuring 4 3/8. Well, that's 1/8 of an inch off, let's say. That adds up. Let's say I have a quilt that has 100 2-inch squares wide and 100 2-inch squares long. Number one, that's going to be a really big quilt. Just do the math on that in my head. But anyway, let's multiply 100 times 1/8 of an inch, because that's how many seams you're going to have, and you're basically losing that 1/8 of an inch with every single seam. Yeah, that's a lot of space. That means that instead of it finishing the size that it's supposed to finish, it's shrunken. And if you have seams crossing that, they're not going to line up no matter how much you fight them. So that was something early on that I discovered. I began pressing my seams open from the very first quilt that I made. Actually, the second quilt that I made, I started pressing my seams open. First quilt that I made every single mistake in the book, and that's fine. That's what first quilts are for. And then started pressing my seams open, loved that technique, kept doing it. And I have continued doing that. I have been quilting now for almost 17 years. That sounds right? Yep, 17 years. I know based on how many years I've been married, because I started quilting and I got married the same year. It's really, really handy when you have something like that to go off of. And 16, 17 years doing one technique means I don't necessarily really want to change that. And when I quilted my quilts, stitched in the ditch, a whole 9 yards on a home sewing machine, which I've done for such a long time now, guys, it was never a problem. It was never an issue. I never once saw the needle pierce a seam. I never once saw a seam gaping, because the fabrics have been pressed open. And I think the major difference here is just the size of the needle. On my long arm, I use a size 18 needle. On my home sewing machines, I mostly have a size 12 needle. I mean, that's a huge, huge difference in size. And the strength and power of the long arm, too, kind of really hammers down the fabric. I think that partly plays a role, too, but really I think it's the size of the needle and it going right in those seams. And I did stitch right in the ditch. I think that all is an element. Now, I have recently, well, pretty much since I started long arm quilting and started using rulers so much, I rarely do stitch in the ditch because I like echo ditching so much more. Echo ditching is stitching 1/4 inch or 1/8 of an inch from that seam. And I do echo ditching. I have a ditcher ruler that is so helpful for staying right in the ditch or echo ditching. And so using that, I think that's the reason why I didn't notice this until now. I pretty much echo ditched most of my quilts. And only with the Christmas tree quilt that I recently finished that I actually did enough stitching in the ditch and was just face to face with those seams and face to face with this issue that I was like, yeah, okay, it's gonna have to change. But I hope that I'm being clear enough with this about that specific, what led to this very specifically, and then I don't have to change my method completely. I'm not going to go straight to pressing seams to one side. I'm going to press them open and get the full expression of the block. So I'm going to get that perfect 4.5-inch block nice and flat. Then I'll take the seams and press them over to one side, pressing them towards the darker fabric. And I think that that's going to work great. That's what I'm doing so far with the Dresden plates. Even though the Dresden plates are technically appliques, they have fabric behind them. So technically I could press all of these seams open. I have found that I really do need to build this as a habit. And so I've got to get it in my head, press open, then press to one side. And I'm working on that slowly. So I hope that this is, I don't know, maybe been insightful, maybe been interesting, or you probably want to take my head off of, because I've taught quilting for so long and I've taught it this one way, and that opinion has influenced a lot of other quilters, and that's okay. I think that if we stop learning and we just continue teaching the same thing, or if I kept this quiet because I was embarrassed to say, hey guys, not necessarily wrong, but just learning, changing, new machine, I could have kept it quiet. I don't have to necessarily put this out there, but I want to. Because if you have suddenly switched from free motion quilting on your home machine to quilting on a long arm, and you have a whole bunch of quilt tops with seams pressed open, well, just simply don't stitch them in the ditch, right? That's the only change that you need to make. Do echo ditching, do all over quilting, do QCT motifs that ignore the seams completely. I mean, you might get an occasional needle right in the middle of a seam, but it's going to be only one stitch versus an entire row of stitching in the ditch. So I hope that makes sense. It's something that when I noticed it, I kind of had that minute of, oh, I don't like that. But I like being honest. I like putting this out there and seeing what happens too. I think that will be interesting. So apart from Dresden plates, I do have a fun project that I'm going to put on my long arm today, hopefully, and I'm going to share a video about it sometime this month, I know, and that's the month of February 2020. And that is a very cute baby quilt, and I'll show you the extra section of the fabric. I designed this, so I designed it in Illustrator, Adobe Illustrator. I designed it at full size, 42 inches wide, and then I uploaded it to Spoonflower and printed it on their organic cotton sateen, which is actually 56 inches wide. So I could have done a 56-inch baby quilt, but I really didn't want that big of a project. So I ended up with a lot of extra fabric here that I think I'm going to end up cutting up to make the binding, and then what I have left over, I'm pretty sure that I will have these cute little blocks. I've got, like a mini Dresden plate that's, kind of a miniature size. It's just a printed panel, guys. This is just printed on fabric, and I'll probably cut that up and make a cloth napkin out of it. But the quilt itself is for a friend who's having a baby later this spring, and it was just fun. It was fun to make that using just digital stuff. I had mini blocks. The hearts were from the mini blocks that I designed. I already had those drawn in Illustrator. I had to kind of wrap my brain around a diamond shape, so kind of looked up different clip art images and stuff, found a diamond shape I liked, drew that in Illustrator, and then I had alphabet letters that I'd already designed, and I just needed to put those in Illustrator to create the letters of her name, the baby's name. And what was the other shape? Hearts, and then hearts. Dresdens were from the Dresdens, and and that's it. And so all of it was digital, and then I had done the fabrics previously, making lots of fabric swatches in many, many different colors. And that was something that was like a tangent that I did several years ago. And at the time it was like, wow, Leah, this is really time consuming and really crazy, and you're never going to use all of these watercolors. And I'm using them all the time now. So it's one of those funny things where the effort and work that I do today may pay off years down the road, right? We never know when we're going to pull out that fabric. We never know when we're going to pull out that thing we created and finally be able to use it. So I'm going to keep it really simple with that quilt when I get it on the frame, and I'm going to keep it super, super simple because I've got to literally get it on and off in about 5 days. Really, honestly, 2 or 3. So it's going to have to be a little speedy. That doesn't mean it's not going to be well quilted. It just means that I'm going to have to be careful about my quilting design and be thinking about that as far as taking on the project, making sure I'm not taking on too much, making sure that I can get it on and off and I'm not going to get bogged down with just too much design, too much quilting. So that's a fun challenge, and I hope that you're looking forward to that video. We do have some quilting design videos coming out this month, and I'm still playing around trying to figure out the best way to showcase designs. I've been playing around with white fabric and purple or blue thread. That worked okay, but it's not gorgeous, I'll put it that way, and that's okay. You know, it's always an effort to figure out what's going to look good and what's going to work. You know, back in the day, starting in 2009, I did little 7-inch squares with a 4-inch square marked in the middle, and that worked amazingly well on a home sewing machine. Finding a long arm is a little bit more challenging. Number one, the amount of fabric that I use and the size and scale of the designs, all that good stuff can make it more challenging to demo and have that look really, really good. Of course, I would love to demo in quilts, but I still have to wrap my brain around demoing in a big enough area that I show you what it looks like, but not so big that I am quilting on it a million years. And then also, what do I end up with in the end? A quilt with a whole bunch of different, you know, confused designs all over the place. You know, I haven't yet found a quilt top that I'm willing to sacrifice, I'll put it that way, to this experimental idea in my head. So we'll see. That's something I'm still working on. Still haven't fixed the crafty cottage. Still haven't set up my hoop frame again. It is an effort to get things done with Betty, I gotta say. It is a continual negotiation of time and nap time and all that good stuff. I love it though. I absolutely love it. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that I've got going on. Prepped up a lot of fabric here, so I'm ready to cut out more Dresden plate petals, Dresden ring petals. I'm excited about that. So if you'd like to follow along and make all of these cute Dresden plates and rings with me, if you'd like to see more about pressing seams open, definitely join in the fun. You can pick up your Dresden Template Set at leahday.com/Dresden. And no, Betty is not going to join us for this particular podcast episode. She's making kind of this like angry roar sound. You know, it's one of those funny things that I noticed today. I was like, that's not a nice sound, Betty, but you know, she's just getting control over her voice, so that's okay, but just probably not the most friendly sound for our podcast. Maybe next month you may see Betty in our podcast 146, so be looking forward to that. So look forward to potentially seeing Betty in episode 146 of the podcast. Until next time, let's go quilt.